Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to the 81st Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning, which it is still just.
Good morning.
And today, having done a two-part Liz Truss retrospective, we're going to do a Boris Johnson retrospective, or at least try. So when did you first meet Boris Johnson, and what impression did he make on you?
Well, the first memorable meeting, we'd sort of bumped into each other before, was actually after a Tory party conference, I should think in 2006. And both of us, one way or another, had made gaffes. So we had led the gaffometer at party conference, and he was actually cycling along Park Street as Mayor of London. And I was going home and was with Helena, and he hailed me as he went past, and we had a jolly conversation about making gaffes. I think it was 2006, but it would have been about then. I think we'd had the conference in Bournemouth.
Can you remember what either of the gaffes were?
Yes. I mean, I'd given an interview to Newsnight, which had annoyed Central Office because I'd said we should have high-quality candidates rather than fill quotas. But I'd phrased it rather colourfully.
Was this the potted plant?
Yes, absolutely right, yes. And the Bristol Evening Post had a rather splendid front page saying, who would you rather have as your candidate, Jacob Rees-Mogg or a potted plant? And I forget what his was. I think he'd basically just overshadowed the then leader of the party at his conference.
As he tended to do. Had you been a candidate by then?
I'd just been adopted as a candidate, yes.
As is 2005, and he'd been elected in 2001. So by the time you saw him, you might have had in the back of your mind the thought he could be a future leader of the party.
He was certainly, by that point, the most charismatic figure within the Conservative Party, unquestionably. He wasn't a member of Parliament, and David Cameron looked very well set then, both as leader of the party and to win an election, and they were broadly the same age. So it wasn't impossible, but it wasn't necessarily likely at that point.
Let's leave the London mayoralty because you weren't involved with the London mayoralty and he wasn't involved with you then, and get nearer the present day. So did you support him in 2016?
Yes, I supported him in 2016 and would have carried on supporting him had he stood. That I'd actually wanted Michael to stand, and Michael hadn't. But then when he did, I recognised I was already committed, and I wouldn't have changed had Boris carried on. Once he pulled out, I went straight over to Michael, for whom I've always had a very high regard.
Even though, he was considered responsible for the collapse of Boris Johnson's campaign?
I mean, the issue there really was that Boris could have carried on, and now you look back at it, you think if Boris had carried on, he would have won. And I never really understood why, and I've never asked him why he pulled out then. I think so many things would have been better had he won in 2016.
Let's explore that question, as I was going to ask you about that. If he'd won in 2016, state to the obvious, he would have been in charge of the Brexit negotiation, not Theresa May. So what do you think would have happened?
I thought that we needed a Brexiteer to become leader then, because I recognised that to get Brexit done, you needed to make compromises. But to make compromises, you need a leader trusted by Brexiteers who would be deeply suspicious of a Remainer making compromises. And in a funny way, this played out 3 years later, because the Brexit deal Boris did was not entirely dissimilar from Theresa May's. Nonetheless, because it was done by a Brexiteer, it was much more trusted than a similar deal done by a Remainer. And what areas am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the money. I thought that one of the areas for us to compromise was money. We had it, they wanted it. And that again, done by a Brexiteer, could perhaps have been used more effectively, rather than the constant battle that there was domestically, because it was somebody who wasn't trusted to do it. So I think there would have been advantages in a Brexiteer negotiating, and somebody who thought that Brexit really worked as an idea, and therefore wasn't so worried as Theresa May's team was by the threats made by the European negotiators.
Do you think he would have insisted on negotiating the whole caboodle at once? I mean, the withdrawal agreement and the trade agreement, because part of the structural weakness of the negotiation is we got suckered into a withdrawal arrangement without doing the trade deal at the same time, but with Northern Ireland in the withdrawal agreement.
I don't think any Brexiteer could understand why that was accepted and why we agreed to do the leave negotiations, the departure negotiations, on the EU's terms. It was a very strange decision, and you have to assume that the negotiators, who were very strongly pro-Remain on our side, the Ollie Robbins of this world, wanted a deal that kept us very close to the EU, and therefore set up a structure of negotiation that would have provided for that.
And so on it went. And then eventually in comes Boris Johnson. And presumably you voted for him in the leadership contest of 2019. Yes. And there's a version of history in which he is the bumbling but effective tool manipulated by a brilliant Dominic Cummings who devises the strategy and gets everything done. I mean, is that a version of history you recognise?
No, it's a great misjudgment of Boris, but I think a very interesting point. I noticed this during the leadership campaign. I worked very closely with Boris in the run-up, from when he resigned through to the leadership campaign. And I saw quite a number of people come round him who thought that they could control him, that they could operate him, and that he was there to be directed. And he'd go along with them in a way. He would use their skills, but he was always and invariably his own man. And I knew that if Dominic Cummings didn't recognise this, it wouldn't work. Boris has never wanted other people to run him. He runs himself. But he's very good-natured, so he doesn't shout at people or rail at people for trying to push him in certain directions. He listens politely and does what he wants to do.
He has had, in different contexts, a couple of really brilliant number twos who've helped steer him through. One was Stuart Reid at The Spectator. The other, now dead, sadly, was Simon Milton at London.
Yes, absolutely. And Simon I knew because I was chairman of the Westminster Association and he was leader of Westminster City Council. So I knew quite well and was a very brilliant man. Why did that relationship work? It worked because Simon was doing what Boris wanted to do and dealing with it in an efficient administrative way. The problem with Dominic Cummings in the end was he didn't really care what Boris wanted to do. He thought it should be what Cummings wanted to do. And this came to an absolute head during lockdown, where Boris wanted to ease lockdowns and Dominic became a fanatic for lockdowns. And that was impossible in the end.
And just going back to Brexit, a key moment was that Boris set a deadline for leaving in the October of 2019, as Theresa May had set deadlines. She missed her deadlines, he missed his deadline. I confess, I thought at that stage that the public would dismiss him as not serious, as they had dismissed Theresa May as not ultimately serious about Brexit. In fact, I made a mistake because they saw that he wanted to leave, and that was the key point.
That's absolutely right. Theresa May didn't want to leave without a deal and was essentially happy to be stopped from leaving without a deal, whereas Boris wanted to leave without a deal and was frustrated by the Benn Act and tried almost everything he could to stop it and was thwarted by an obligation, quite rightly, to obey the law.
But in the end, leaving with a deal was integral, wasn't it, to his near landslide later that year, because it solved a number of political problems. A certain sort of voter wanted Brexit done, but they felt safer with a deal, so they voted for Boris Johnson. And the Liberal Democrats, who built a whole programme on fighting a Conservative government that hadn't got a deal, suddenly found it was dealing with a Conservative government with a deal, and didn't really know what to do. So that was the end of them.
Yes. I think the view that it was broadly helpful to leave with a deal was a good one. I think the problem for our negotiations, weakness of the negotiations, particularly for Theresa May, but also for Boris, was a feeling that we had to leave with a deal, and therefore that gave strength to the other side of the negotiation. So the Benn Act was a terrible piece of legislation to undermine the position of Her Majesty's, as it then still was, government against its foreign interlocutors. It was a really disgraceful piece of legislation that undermined the strength of the negotiators.
We'll come back to that when we discuss Brexit in due course, but we move on. There we are. Boris Johnson wins this with a majority of 80. So simple question, I suppose. What went wrong?
Yes, and how did we go from the period of September 2021, when the newspapers were writing up at the time of the reshuffle that Boris was the most powerful prime minister in modern history, that he could go on for a decade, to him being out of office within a year? Some of it is consequential, that lockdown was very difficult for people. And the government of the day, we've seen lots of governments that were responsible for lockdown becoming less popular as lockdown has ended. We've even seen it in China, where you wouldn't have expected. Some of it was economic, that the economy was turning down, and then you had the very sharp increase in fuel prices and the inflation coming back and the prospect of higher interest rates. So you had a difficult economic backdrop. And then you had some mistakes that were taken out of all proportion. So you had the issues around the so-called parties, which weren't parties, and the Prime Minister had a very good defence for. You have the very odd decision by the Metropolitan Police to investigate and prosecute, which I think was quite extraordinary and political, basically. I think they were under political pressure from the Mayor of London. That didn't do them any good, because he still fired Cressida Dick at the end of the process. So you had all sorts of things going on, and still quite a lot of disgruntled Tory MPs who never really wanted Boris and never really reconciled themselves to Brexit. So you had a Paris Tory party.
Does it really explain what happened? I mean, you run through a series of events, some of which were truly very big, like the coronavirus. But governments have got themselves into terrific trouble before. For example, Tony Blair really had to carry the vote for the Iraq War pretty much against his party. He survived. Margaret Thatcher went through terrible times in the early 1980s. Really, at one point, the Conservatives were third in the polls. She survived. David Cameron went through some sort of pretty rocky times. I feel there was something else going on, which in the end was that just not enough of his ministerial colleagues felt you could rely on Boris when push came to shove, and that because he was a master of subverting the system, and you were the system, you couldn't rely on him. And in the end, this brought him down.
That was not my experience. My experience was that Boris, once he'd made a decision, would support his ministers in the decision. I think people made a mistake, and they sometimes thought Boris had agreed with them when he hadn't. People read into Boris's good nature support for something that he hadn't agreed. And if you have conversations with Boris, it's very interesting because, well, I'll give you a specific example. In the leadership campaign, and you may even sympathise with the case I was making, I was encouraging him to scrap HS2, which I thought then, I think now, is a terrible waste of money. Doesn't affect my constituency, and I've never voted against it because I don't feel it's outside the limit of the mistakes governments are allowed to make if you're of their party. Nonetheless, I think it's a terrible waste of money. And I go on and on at poor Boris saying this is a terrible idea and you really ought to scrap it. And he'd sit there, probably sit in here, sympathising and being agreeable. Never once did he say that he agreed with me or that he would do it. But he always left me feeling he had heard the argument. And I knew, really, that he was never going to scrap it. But until he was Prime Minister and had to make the formal decision, he listened politely. Now, it would have been very easy to think that that polite listening was agreement rather than polite listening. And I think a lot of people overinterpret polite listening.
It's not quite what I was thinking of. What I thought mattered in the end was something more like this, that you're a minister and you have to go on the wireless to defend the government, and you're asked a question like, did the Prime Minister know such and such about such and such an MP, Christopher Pincher? And you'd say, well, I believe so. The interviewer would say, do you know so? Well, that's what I've been told. And you could hear that the minister didn't have the confidence that what they'd been told was correct.
But that wasn't really a question of the Prime Minister, because they were telling the Prime Minister, if you go to Partygate, the same thing. So the number 10 line was that all the rules were followed at all times. I had my briefings for business questions, and I was told the line was that all the rules were followed at all times. And that was coming from the Downing Street machine, not personally from Boris. And Boris was repeating that line, which was the line that perhaps got him into the most trouble. And I actually didn't use this line and had no intention of using it, because as I wasn't there, how could I be certain? And is it really within human nature in an office with hundreds of people that all the rules were followed at all times? But nonetheless, that was the system coming up with a certainty that you couldn't actually guarantee. And I actually think this is part of the problem of politics, is you try and control the message too closely, whereas I think listeners to radio programs are intelligent and they know that there are shades of grey. They know that you can't authoritatively say X has never heard in his life a rumour about Y. I mean, you know what politics is like. There are rumours that go around the whole time, and some of them go in one ear and out the other. And you don't remember, or you may remember when something happens later on, you think, oh goodness, I did hear that thing some years ago. And so I would turn it the other way around. I think the system needs an element of subverting, because it tries to pretend that there is a certainty which doesn't really exist.
Does it matter if he went to the dispatch box, said things that weren't right, believing them to be right when he said them, but didn't go back to correct the record? Is that why he's now, one might almost say, allowed himself to fall into this trap set by, arguably, by people who don't like him, and he's the subject to this inquiry?
Well, he did ultimately correct the record. I think it is perfectly reasonable to expect ministers to rely on the briefings that they are given. Otherwise, questions in Parliament collapse. That you can't expect ministers to investigate personally every single answer that they give. There are too many answers being given. You get official briefings. They state what the policy is and what has happened. And there's wrong and wrong, isn't there? That some things, the Department of Transport, I forget precisely, wanted me to correct the backlog of correspondence at the DVLA. I think I'd called them letters, and they said they were packages, or, you know. And I said, look, I'm not correcting that. That's just ridiculous that nobody's going to think there's any real difference in. It wasn't packages. I haven't got the word quite right, but they wanted a formal correction in hand size. It was absurd. It was just silly, and so I wouldn't do that. And the Foreign Office flapped at me whenever I said anything about China and wanted me to tone it down when I was Leader of the House. And I wouldn't correct that either, because the Leader of the House has a certain leeway in interpreting what government policy is, and actually it is what government policy is, fortunately. And so you can't correct every nuance that somebody disagrees with. You do need to correct, as Boris did, something that is substantially wrong. That is to say, all the rules were followed at all times. They clearly weren't, because people were fined.
What was he good at as Prime Minister? I mean, we know he's a wonderful way with language. We know he can make a first-class speech when he's put the effort in. And we know that he has a cut-through with a certain sort of voter, or had at any rate, probably still does. But what was he actually good at doing the job?
Rather than campaigning. Because he is brilliant. He is an extraordinary, charismatic figure, and very rare in politics in that. He is decisive. He's good at making big decisions. Now, and I know this is the sort of line to take, but I simply don't believe that anyone else would have made the decision around Ukraine in the way that he made it and delivered it in the way that he delivered it, which is one of the biggest and most important foreign policy decisions of this generation, isn't it? It's been absolutely fundamental to stand up for what one might broadly call Western values. And if it hadn't been done, no one has any idea where Putin would have stopped. And Boris not just led the UK, but he led the world in this. And I've said before, which people complain about, it would not have happened had we been in the European Union, because we would have been bound in by the doctrine of sincere cooperation. And the doctrine of sincere cooperation would have meant that the Germans and the French would have not been enthusiastic about helping Zelensky, and that therefore we would have sat on our hands.
What did he do that any Prime Minister of, perhaps Conservative Prime Minister anyway, of a Brexit Britain wouldn't do? Because one way of thinking about the Western response to Ukraine is that the main countries have done what you'd expect them to do, broadly speaking. The Americans have taken quite a tough line. Germany and France, who are more enmeshed with Russia, have been more equivocal. We've sailed in with the Americans, as we've tended to do over the entire post-war period. What's different about what Boris Johnson
I think
did?
we went ahead of the Americans. And we, in a funny way, we gave the Americans cover to do what America wanted to do. And America very much weakened by Afghanistan, and a feeling that it was withdrawing from the world and that its global adventures had failed. So from the perspective of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the US was not looking to global leadership, and it was certainly not looking to taking on Putin. It was quite dented by that. And by Boris delivering arms to the Ukrainians, by leading the way in terms of advocating sanctions, the Americans were able to take up the running on that and provide much greater support subsequently than we have. But I wonder if an American foreign policy that had not recovered from Afghanistan would have done this if Europe had been wet on the subject and Britain hadn't been independent of Europe to do it.
And just finally in this section, because we're going to have to do the economy some other time, coronavirus. You were saying earlier that, and I've experienced this myself, you can be in a room with Boris Johnson and think he's agreed to something. In fact, you think he has, but he's not actually said that he has. So if you think he has, it's your fault, not his. Wasn't there this degree of ambiguity about his attitude to the virus from the start? So he went through this bit of Dominic Cummings, I think probably is true. I could hear Boris Johnson saying that he would inject himself with the thing on live TV at the start. He then nearly dies of it. But then at some stage, despite having nearly died of it, he isn't buttressed in support of lockdowns. Actually, as time goes on, he appears to become more and more sceptical of lockdowns. Tell me the story as you saw it.
Well, you used to have the picture of the good angel and the devil whispering in his ear. You can decide which I was, because I was definitely whispering in his ear that we should get away from lockdowns from relatively early on, after the first lockdown. I was very keen that we should not have further lockdowns. So he had that coming to him from some of his strong supporters. Thank heavens this country was led by somebody who didn't revel in lockdowns. This is so important, that lockdowns were dreadful. The imposition on people, the denial of people to see members of their family, to go to funerals, to go to school, to go about their daily business. We have never been so controlled as a country. We think of ourselves as a free country, and all our freedoms were abrogated, and the state had a right to ask you where you were going, what you were doing. And stupid policemen arrested, and it was in Derbyshire, wasn't it, arrested women for having a cup of coffee. You've got some ridiculous zealotry going on in this. And if we had had a leader who liked lockdowns, like the New Zealand Prime Minister or like the Chinese President, just think how unbearable it would have been. And we had a very calm lockdown. We had, as soon as the police overstepped, they got knocked back and removed fines for those women and so on. And that we had a liberty-loving Prime Minister doing it when he didn't want to, rather than having some of the other ministers who absolutely loved it, or Cummings himself, who revelled in taking control of people's lives, was an absolute boon for the country, allowed us to open faster than anybody else, and made the burden imposed on the British people less than it was in other countries.
Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor of the day, doesn't seem to have liked lockdown very much either.
No, indeed. I don't think he did. He recognised the damage it was doing to the economy.
So, although you've got a Prime Minister who was very sceptical about lockdowns and a kind of institutional treasury that didn't like the effect it was having on the economy, nonetheless, the lockdowns carried on happening after the first.
Yes, and although I was saying privately to the then PM that I wasn't in favour of them, I always recognised I would have made the same decisions as he did. Why? Because you were being told that you were going to kill people if you didn't. I had this ridiculous forecast that 500,000 people would die.
Did you ever see him raise an eyebrow at these forecasts?
Raising an eyebrow and saying, well, I know more than these people, is two very different things that I was certainly raising an eyebrow when I heard them. They seemed improbable. But I'm not an epidemiologist. So you're in a very weak position as a politician to challenge these forecasts when they're being given to you at the early stages of a lockdown. And the experts were telling us much the same with the Omicron Christmas last year, and wanted another lockdown. And it was Boris who decided not to do it. And that was a brave decision, because had he been wrong and had the epidemiologists been right, then not only would he had on his conscience a large number of deaths, but it would have meant that the whole strategy would have failed. So that was a very big decision. So it goes back to my saying he got the big decisions right.
Just absolutely last on coronavirus, and then we're going to have to stop. Did this experience of having nearly died, did it change him at all?
I think one thing that he won't thank me for saying is he took much longer to recover than he allowed himself, and he should have rested more. He should probably have taken a couple of months to recover fully rather than getting back to work. It was very dutiful of him to get back to work so quickly, but I think made him very, very unwell. Well, obviously made him very, very unwell, and I think he should have taken more time to recover.
When do you think he was fully back?
It's difficult to say, because with Boris, whenever you see him, he's always full of beans. But I just think with that level of illness and being in intensive care, somebody is likely to need longer to recover. And it would have been very difficult for him to do that, but it would have been in his own interests to do that.
Well, Jacob, thank you very much. We've sort of done bits of Brexit, the virus in Ukraine. We haven't timed it. We will come back next time to talk about Boris Johnson and the economy, which is, goodness knows, a very topical subject.
Indeed.
And once again, thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure, as always.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.